When it comes to portrait lenses, I tend to prefer f1.8 primes as opposed to f1.4 or even f1.2 lenses that some manufacturers produce. And the reason for this is because f1.8 primes tend to be smaller, lighter, they cost less money, and the difference in image quality is not significant at all. To be honest, it's negligible in many cases. So when Canon released their RF mount 85mm f2 lens, I was really excited about this lens and I wanted to compare it to my current 85mm lens on the Sony, which is the Zeiss Batis 85mm f1.8. So in this video, that's exactly what we're going to do. The weather is horrible, it's freezing, I'm actually wearing gloves for once. So we're going to go out, take some pictures and see how each of these lenses compare to one another. Okay, so let's quickly run through some of the design and specifications between both of these lenses. First of all, the Zeiss is a much better built, much better designed, beautiful looking lens in comparison to the Canon. The feel, the quality, everything about this is just really, really nice. Zeiss has done a fantastic job. Focus ring is really smooth and really comfortable in the hand. The OLED screen, I've never used it in all fairness, but it's really nice to look at. And just the overall design, like it's a beautiful, beautiful looking lens. The Canon, on the other hand, it's very bland, to say the least. I mean, it's a very functional looking lens. It's got nothing particularly stylish about it. It's all function over style, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but if we're looking at it just from like the design perspective, you know, the Zeiss is clearly the winner here. However, the Canon does have a front dial on the end of the lens, which is useful if you want to be able to change some of the settings. I tend to use it for the aperture ring, so that is quite useful. And then you've got some switches over here which allow you to control the stabilizing features, the autofocus, and the focus limiters as well. So again, very functional in terms of what it is. The Canon is also a heavier lens, slightly heavier in comparison to the Zeiss, but in the hand it doesn't really make that much of a difference. And also the Canon can focus a lot closer to the subject than the Zeiss does. So even though this has a slightly wider aperture, because of the fact that you can focus significantly closer, by 35 centimeters is the minimum focus distance, 80 centimeters on the Zeiss, and that closeness or that distance that you can reduce between you and the subject means that you can produce much shallower depth of field with the 85 RF lens than you can with the Zeiss Batis. Overall, the Zeiss is like a perfect balance between good design and style and functionality, whereas the Canon is completely on the functional end of the spectrum with very little in terms of like design and aesthetics. Now that we've finished shooting with our model, there are a few things that we've noticed between both cameras. First of all, the Canon feels a lot snappier. The autofocus in the Canon is brilliant. I'm thoroughly impressed with how good the autofocus is. It's much better than what it is in the Sony a7R III. However, that is not a fair point by any means, because I'm comparing current technology from Canon versus technology that's a few years old from Sony. I'm assuming that the a7R IV and the a7S III has far better autofocus features compared to the a7R III. So, you know, that's probably a more apples to apples comparison if we're going to compare latest tech. The other thing I'm noticing is image quality or colors. Colors on the Canon look really, really nice. Now we're only looking at the back of the screen, so this is not a proper comparison, it's not a proper analysis, and we're going to reserve judgment of our actual conclusions until we look at the images on a larger screen. But just looking at the back of the screen, Canon looks beautiful. Even the model responded really positively to the Canon images, but not so much with the Sony. Now, I will say that the Sony colors look more accurate, especially in the blouse and the coat that the model was wearing. Colors look more accurate with the Sony. However, Canon looks better, although Canon's leaning a little bit too much into those warmer tones, but maybe that's what's making the images look a bit more vibrant and look a little bit more nicer. Anyway, we're going to jump into Lightroom now and we're going to do a proper side-by-side comparison and actually see which lens is performing better than the other. Okay, so here we have some images opened up in Lightroom, and the first thing I want to talk about is colors. The Canon EOS R5 renders some of the most beautiful colors I have seen from a camera. They're absolutely stunning. I've been comparing them to a number of cameras, and the Canon does such a good job, even when compared to previous older generation Canon cameras. Now, in this image, the model skin tones may look a little orange, but that's supposed to be like that because there are lots of orange lights around her, so it's relatively accurate. And I just think the Canon does a fantastic job. White balance for this was daylight, and if I put this side by side to the Sony image, you can see how much of a difference there is. Sony just looks a little green, a little muted, and I've adjusted the white balance. I've made some adjustments in Lightroom as well. We're using a Sony specific color profile, not Adobe. We're using a Sony specific color profile, and the Canon just looks a heck of a lot better. I love the colors coming from the Canon camera. The only problem with the Canon camera is the fact that this is a JPEG. This is a RAW file on the Sony side, but the Canon image is a JPEG. And the reason we have to use a JPEG is because there's no Canon specific color profiles currently available in Lightroom. And when you use the Adobe profiles, the Canon images look horrible. So if I put the Canon RAW file next to the JPEG, you can see just how much of a difference there is. The colors coming straight out of camera for the Canon are beautiful, whereas the RAW file, because there's no Canon specific profiles in Lightroom, they just look pretty poor. In fact, they look terrible. I really dislike the way that the EOS R5 images look when you take the RAW files into Lightroom. Like, look at this color over here. It looks horrible. I've tried all the profiles from Adobe in Lightroom, and all of them look horrible. If we put both RAW files side by side, you can see that the Sony actually does a better job in terms of colors when you've got the RAW files, because the color profiles from Adobe are pretty poor when applied to the Canon image. However, this comparison is more about the lenses as opposed to the cameras. So let's zoom in and have a look at the results. And honestly, I can't really tell that much of a difference. I'm going to say that the Zeiss appears to be just a little bit sharper in comparison to the Canon, and it's just picking up a slightly, a little bit more detail in comparison to the Canon file. For the next couple of images, I just wanted to look at the difference in bokeh, and at f1.8, yes, it's slightly wider in terms of the aperture, but it's not that much wider. However, the bokeh from the Zeiss is noticeably shallower, and it's also not as wide in terms of field of view in comparison to the Canon. Like the Canon, I don't think it's a true 85mm lens, because even in other comparisons that I've seen, it just appears like a wider lens with a deeper depth of field at f2 compared to what it actually should be. So, you know, the Zeiss, I'd say that the Zeiss is a more accurate representation of what an 85mm lens will look like. The depth of field is a little bit shallower. You know, the bokeh balls are less defined. They both have that cat's eye effect on the edges, so it's not really that big of a deal, but the depth of field is just slightly shallower in comparison. However, colors from the Canon JPEGs, absolutely stunning, just beautiful looking color coming from the camera. When it comes to chromatic aberrations, both lenses are pretty poor in extreme circumstances. Now, in a lot of real world shooting scenarios, I haven't had either of these lenses perform badly when it comes to chromatic aberrations, but in really high contrast areas, you can see just how bad the chromatic aberrations can get for both lenses. So I don't think either one performs better than the other. Across the frame, you've got a lot of purple fringing. The Zeiss might be slightly better, but honestly, it's so close that it's not even worth giving a point on either side. So both lenses in extreme circumstances and very high contrast situations will demonstrate a lot of chromatic aberrations. But in real world shooting, I couldn't really find a scenario where this was a problem in most situations. I think both lenses do quite a good job in normal circumstances, but in these really high contrast scenarios, they both tend to struggle equally. Finally, we're going to be looking at the detail and sharpness that both of these lenses can produce in a controlled environment. And wide open, both lenses do a really good job, although I'm going to say that the Zeiss is just a tiny bit sharper which says a lot about the Canon. Like, the Canon is quite an inexpensive lens in comparison, and it is a fantastic performer when it comes to the optics. Like, the detail that it captures is just beautiful. It's extremely sharp. And yes, the Zeiss is a sharper lens, but not by a great deal. So that's definitely something to boast about when it comes to the Canon. In fact, in certain areas, the Canon is slightly sharper, quite a bit sharper actually. So I have to say, the Canon does a fantastic job, although the Zeiss is slightly better. Stopping both lenses down to f5.6, which is effectively the sharpest point for both of these lenses, center sharpness is pretty much identical. There really isn't any difference that I can see. However, the resolution in the corners, Canon is a slightly sharper lens, and this is in all the corners. You can see how there's just a tiny bit of smudginess on the Zeiss lens, whereas the Canon is sharper across the whole frame. So wide open, the Zeiss is slightly, just a tiny bit sharper. However, when you start stopping the lens down, the Canon not only catches up, but actually starts to outperform the Zeiss in certain areas. So there you have it. That's how both lenses compare against one another. And in all honesty, from an overall standpoint, they're basically on par with one another. I mean, in terms of sharpness and detail, the Zeiss is slightly better wide open, but then when you stop down, the Canon catches up. So kind of depends really. I mean, both lenses do have their respective advantages and disadvantages. The Canon does have macro features as well, which maybe I should have covered in this video, but I didn't really want to go down that route because I wanted to compare these lenses as portrait lenses. But if you bring that into the equation, the Canon is better value for money. It offers better results. It offers better or more options. It's the better option. It's the better lens in comparison to the Zeiss, especially when you consider the fact that it's half the price. I mean, Canon has done something remarkable. They're producing incredible lenses. Even their budget entry-level lenses for their RF mount cameras are just ridiculously good. They're such good lenses. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I obviously like the Zeiss lens. I mean, I bought that lens, I own that lens, but I'm just blown away by how good the lenses are for the RF mount cameras. Canon has truly done something special. But I think the biggest or the most underrated feature from Canon's latest mirrorless cameras, or Canon's EOS R5 camera, is the way that it renders color. And I think that not many people have really gone into this, but I've been doing comparisons on this, and I'm going to be talking more about this in my next video as well. The EOS R5 produces some of the best colors I have seen across the board from probably most cameras. There may be like one or two cameras which kind of on par, maybe slightly better, but the EOS R5 is just in a different league when it comes to color. And as much as I love the Sony cameras, I mean, clearly I'm a fan of Sony. I own the Sony camera. It's my camera. I bought and paid for it. Clearly I'm a fan. But the Canon is doing something incredible when it comes to color. I love the way that it renders any particular scene, any given scene. It just looks amazing. There's just something beautiful about the colors from the EOS R5. And I think that as soon as Canon or Adobe, you know, get their act together and start producing camera specific profiles for Lightroom and Photoshop, Canon's gonna have a major advantage. I mean, you can clearly see the difference. It's not really like a negligible thing like, oh yeah, we can just slightly make some adjustments. It's a defined difference between both systems. And I think Canon has done something pretty incredible with their latest mirrorless cameras. Anyway, just want to say thank you so much for watching our video. If you like this video, hit the like button, please subscribe, share this video, and hope to see you all in the next one. Thank you.